Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. I'm joined by Sheldon Richman, the foundation's vice president. This is the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the libertarian perspective on what's going on in the world. Sheldon, it was kind of interesting last Friday in your TGIF article. You wrote about nationalism in response to this controversy over Chris Kyle, the American sniper. And coincidentally and totally independently, I wrote my blog post that day on public schooling in the national security state, which sort of was addressing the same issue you were addressing, and you were focusing on nationalism. I was focusing on this other aspect of it. So I thought, hey, let's discuss that. I think it goes to the heart of this controversy. We've caught some flack from people for questioning what the troops were doing in Iraq. Same type of flack we were catching right after the invasion of Iraq. Where we were pointing out that the U.S. government was waging a war of aggression against a country that had not attacked the United States, and of course without the constitutionally required congressional declaration of war. So I thought, hey, let's talk about these different angles and analyze them and share them with our viewers. So why don't you go first? Why don't you explain what you mean by nationalism? You know, people have heard that term, but I'm not sure everybody's got a really good grasp of what exactly you're talking about. What is it that you're criticizing when you talk about nationalism?
What I mean is sort of a quasi-religious worship of the country as if it's some sort of entity, nearly mystical entity. I could say corporate entity. By that I don't mean corporation like business, but I mean it like it has a body, corp. The root of that word is corporeal. We talk about being a physical thing. People talk about the nation and the country as if it's not just a collection of people who are, united under a single political system and set of laws, although, with 50 states we don't have one set of laws. There is variation. But still people treat the country as if it's this entity that deserves reverence and worship. So you have the Pledge of Allegiance, and you have, singing the national anthem and other songs at public gatherings. And we have to constantly remind ourselves that in the case of America, where this is the greatest nation on earth, the greatest nation in the history of the world, without constantly reassuring ourselves about this. It's not just love of the place where I was born or fellow feeling toward my community. It's not that kind of thing, the way one loves, say, one's family. That's perfectly sensible and rational and proper, and I have no trouble understanding that. But when people say the country, don't you love America? That's not a question that I think can be easily answered, because America is a term they're using, and they're packing all kinds of stuff in there, which includes, I think, the government. Some people may say no, we can separate it, but I don't think most people are separating it. And so that's what I mean by nationalism, this fervor, which elicits such anger if you say anything to question it. Like, say, America waged a war of aggression in Iraq. That will set people off. Why? Because America, you're talking against America. Are you anti-American? Those are the kinds of reactions I got as we discussed the Chris Kyle story.
And so would you say that concept of nationalism was less pronounced when the nation got started? Because it seems to me that you had the individual states coming together to form, essentially a confederation. You had the Articles of Confederation. But my recollection was in the early days, like before the Civil War, the United States was referred to in the plural. The United States are. And that people saw themselves as really citizens of the respective states. And when Robert E. Lee and others during the Civil War said, I need to go back to my respective state. Now, maybe it's nationalism at the state level, but would you say it was less pronounced during that period of time? Or you think the same thing?
Oh, sure, but there were people from the very start, influential people, who were working to change that. And this is an old story. Many nations that we know today, France, Italy, Germany, were not always unified nations, right? The nation state is a relatively recent thing. It comes into the end of the 18th and then 19th century. Before that, you had states like Germany, And they had some link, perhaps, language, although there was a lot of variation even in the language from dialects and actually other languages. But once a unification movement got going in those countries, just like in the United States, there's then efforts at the top to create a sense of nation, in other words, nationalism. There's a famous line from one of the people that helped to unify the Italian states into Italy. After they formally had it united, one of these people who was involved in the unification movement said, okay, we have Italy. Now we need Italians. In other words, now we need to instill nationalism as Italian. Otherwise, you were whatever your own little province or state was. And it was similar to the United States. Yeah, Patrick Henry at one point says that Virginia is his country. Well, we could say that that was a form of nationalism, too. I'm not saying that's any better. But once the United States was created, or once people wanted to create it, even before it was created, they went to work on instilling a sense of nationalism at the state level, at the national level. And they realized they had a problem to overcome because, like you say, people originally were more conscious of the states because it hadn't been a unified country. So they went to work on that, and they did it in various ways, propagandistic ways. So that's why in my article I have a quote from Ernest Gellner, who's wrote a lot about nationalism, and he makes this very interesting point that nationalism begets nations. It's not the other way around.
Well, so do you think it's possible to have a nation state, like to be living in the United States today, without people having this fervor of nationalism?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not sure I totally know the answer to that. A lot of views would have to change because people do see the nation state as sort of the unit, the relevant unit, and anything below that is more or less an administrative district, right? I mean, people don't think about the states the way they used to think about the states. And the advantage of decentralization, in my view, you can have a quote nationalism at the state level, right? You can think about your state the way people think about the country, but I don't think that's good. I don't think that's any better. You could have possibly states going to war with each other, but the advantage of it being small jurisdictions is that it's cheaper to vote with your feet, and that does exercise some competitive pressure. If people are going to leave because they don't like what's going on inside the state, then that might exert some pressure on the politicians. So, but I think it's so tied up with this sort of mystical notion of the state after all these years that it seems hard to. It seems like it would be hard to divorce all of that.
Okay, but then the
various parts.
But that sort of then leads into what I was concentrating on, which was the public government schooling system and the national security state system, the vast military establishment, the CIA, this apparatus, this military intelligence apparatus that came into existence after World War II. Because if you look at Switzerland, for example, and the American system originally from 1787 all the way through the 19th century was effectively modeled on the Swiss model, which was decentralization of power within the country and limited strictly to defense, and everybody's armed and everybody's well trained. Everybody's got assault rifles in their houses. They have somewhat of a basic military establishment, but mostly it's just citizen soldiers, and everybody knows where they're going to report in case of an invasion of their country. So I guess my first question would be, is there this sense of nationalism in Switzerland? It doesn't seem as destructive, and I think if there is, and I think part of the reason is, well, they obviously have public schooling, but this sense of public schooling inculcates, as you've written in your book, Separating School and State, this mindset of deference to authority and obedience and the Pledge of Allegiance every morning. I mean, the Pledge of Allegiance is like the Sermon on the Mount for people. I mean, you know that I've often said that the national security state, the government, has become an idol for many, many Christians. I mean, it's like, so if you criticize the troops, that's like heresy. They don't get too upset if you criticize St. Paul or St. Peter, but man, you criticize the troops and all form of calumny is going to come down on you because of this sense, this idolization. And part of that is what's been going on since the first grade, the Pledge of Allegiance, which, by the way, was written by a socialist, as you know. And then you've got that compounded with this huge military establishment where many of the American people are veterans. So it's a double whammy. You've got Army Light, which is public schooling, obedience, regimentation, conformity, and then a malleable mindset. Then you have all this huge military establishment, so that whatever now the military says, whatever the Joint Chiefs of Staff says or the president says, man, everybody just, their mindsets automatically accept that as reality. And so that's why I would say that this is the real core of the problem. You've got a government, quote, educational system that forms these mindsets of conformity, obedience, deference to authority, and then aggravated by this huge national security state that's out doing horrible things in the world, but people won't accept that. Now, you call it nationalism. I say it's just this idolization of the military, that whatever they say, that's what we need to do because of the mindset of conformity and obedience.
Well, it is an idolatry. You're absolutely right about that. I don't think it's just about the military, though. The military is for them a very important component and symbol. It can be very visible, planes flying overhead, tanks, combat, which gives you a sense of glory through war. But it's not just the military. It's the state. It's the state in both senses of that word, the nation state, and the idolatry can be seen in the pledging allegiance to a flag. What does it mean, pledging allegiance to a flag? I mean, think of there was a great article about this in the Harper's many years ago about the rituals attached to the flag. If the flag touches the ground, what happens? Oh my God! The flag touched the ground. What are you supposed to do? You're supposed to kiss it, I think, or something like that. This is religion. In the Jewish religion, if the main prayer book, called the Siddur, touches the floor, you immediately pick it up and kiss it. I mean, it was like a terrible thing happened. Well, that's religion. I'll leave that in its own province, okay? That's God. I won't comment about that. We transfer that over to the secular thing, this piece of cloth, and yet call it a piece of cloth. And them's fighting words in some people's. Don't say that in a bar, in the wrong bar, because some people take those as fighting words. Remember, there was a time when, gosh, if you sewed a flag to the seat of your pants, you probably would have gotten beaten up, and that went to the Supreme Court. Luckily, the court found that was an example of freedom of expression. Now, of course, you can buy all kinds of stuff with the flag on it, and it's regarded as patriotic. So we've really turned around there, but for some people, it is a form of idolatry. And you can see, I think there was a force from the very beginning in the United States, just like in those other countries I mentioned, a pulling together, from the outward edge to the center. I mean, Hamilton and those people felt they had to create this sense of that the national government was primary. State governments were secondary. That was their intention from very early on. And there was anti-federalist resistance, but they got, some of it wasn't quite, the Federalists didn't always play fair, like keeping their stuff out of the mail and stuff like that, keeping their pamphlets out of the mail. But they lost, basically, in the court of public opinion, and this nationalist feeling did grow. It really strengthened after the Civil War, of course, but the people were, not without a lot of difficulty, were brought along to believe in this nationalism that both you and I are critical of now.
Yeah, but I think there was a large sector of American society that was against that sort of thing. I mean, when the Constitution was being proposed, many people were against it. They were very skeptical. They had operated under a government, the British Empire, that is in many respects is similar to the government we're operating under today. And so people had to convince them, the framers had to convince them, this is going to be a government of limited powers, enumerated powers. And then even that wasn't good enough for the Americans at that time. They said, no, we want a Bill of Rights, which was really a bill of prohibitions, because we know this government's going to do bad things to us. So my argument always is that if Americans had known in 1787 that it was going to bring into existence the type of government we have today, if they were going to live under this type of government we're living under today, there was no chance that the Constitution would have ever been approved, because you can tell their distrust and skepticism with the Bill of Rights and the enumerated powers. They were saying, we don't want a government like that. I mean, they hated and despised everything that that Americans have brought into existence today. And so, I would consider them the patriots. When you were talking about patriotism, to me, what distinguishes us libertarians from everyone else, the non-libertarians, is that we think in terms of right and wrong. So to me, the real patriot is the one that does critical analysis of what his government is doing. If his government's doing the right thing, he supports it. But if it's doing the wrong thing, he doesn't support it. He opposes it. He stands up and says no, and then he does everything he can to get the government on the right track. That, to me, is the genuine patriot. And you know that one of my favorite stories in history is the White Rose, where these students in Germany in the middle of World War II, where the troops are dying on the battlefield and the nation is at stake, they start publishing these pamphlets saying our government is wrong. And they were considered bad people, unpatriotic, traitors. Well, to me, that's the duty of a citizen, is to critically analyze what the government's doing and then stand up against it. That's why we call the people that were signed the Declaration of Independence patriots. They were standing up against their own government. They weren't Americans at that point. They were British citizens. They were standing up against the British government. And that's where I see this whole thing with the whole national security state, the public schooling thing, is that they created this mindset that really effectively says, in foreign affairs at least, my government, not right or wrong, my government never wrong. So that if it attacks a country, let's say they attack Costa Rica, which has no army, for whatever reason. I mean, I think people would go in and believe any kind of nonsense it was, that even if they had to kill 10,000 Costa Ricans, they'd say this is for self-defense, this is for WMDs, whatever the government says, the people are going to automatically accept it. And that's in comparison to us libertarians that say, that is wrong and we have to stand up against it. That, to me, is the difference here with respect to the genuine patriot.
But most people, of course, don't think you're right. They do accept, if not my government never wrong, or my country never wrong. I guess the moderate position is my government right or wrong, because at least there's a concession there. There could be wrong, but you're still supported no matter what. And I think they see the government and the society and the country all fused together into the nation. I think that's how they think of it. Like I said, from the beginning, there were major American figures who were trying to create this sense of nationalism. Don't forget, the British, of course, thought that the Americans were traitors and insurgents, basically. Yeah. I have to think that all these people who attack us over Kyle would have been siding with the British government back then, because they would have agreed that they would agree with the British that we were savages. Why? Because we were resisting what we then regarded as an occupation by the Redcoats, right, and the King's governors and other officers, customs agents, and there was what you might call terrorism against people.
Right.
Otherwise, I think some of the violence was unjustified, but we won't get into that right now. The point is, these people today would have to agree with what the Brits were saying, that we were the savages, the Americans back then were the savages, the ones that were resisting, the ones that wanted to break away. And, of course, in the prevailing terms, they were traitors, right? They owed allegiance to the king, and they were saying, no, we don't. We don't know allegiance anymore. That's what the Declaration was saying. That sounds like treason. And, of course, there were even Americans here who accused other Americans of treason, John Adams and others, of committing treason. So, it depends on what side of the table you're sitting at. It can look very differently. What is it? One person's terrorist, another person's a freedom fighter. And in fact, sometimes the same person takes different positions depending on, what happens. And we've seen that in the Middle East.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, the British were hanging people that they would capture because you're right. In their minds, they were traitors. In my mind, they were patriots. And I agree with you. I think a lot of the statists today would have never sided with the people that signed the Declaration of Independence and who were rebelling against their own government. I think they would have said, support the troops, support the troops. And, of course, the troops were the British troops, their own government's troops. The concept of saying, no, what King George has done and what his troops are doing with gun control and gun confiscation and warrantless searches, they would not have stood up against that. They would have said, whatever the government does, it's doing in our interest, in the interest of national security or whatever, because you can see it with respect to the NSA, the spying. It's no different from the warrantless searches that King George was doing. And so I agree with you. I think the Libertarians clearly would have been on the side of the rebels in 1776, but I think it'd be difficult to say the statists would be. Let me delve a little bit into this orders thing. You know, you and I have questioned whether troops should have followed orders to go into Iraq, and my position is that they should have disobeyed orders. And soldiers are taught. You know, we often think that soldiers have to blindly obey orders, that they're just victims. And that's just not true. Every soldier's taught that you cannot obey an illegal order. And you're going to be prosecuted if you do. And I just watched last night part of this movie, Fury, with Brad Pitt. And there's a scene in there where they've got a German soldier in captivity. And Pitt, who's playing the role of a sergeant in a tank platoon, orders this new soldier in. Guy's very sensitive, and he doesn't have any combat experience. He orders him to shoot the soldier, to shoot the guy in captivity. And the guy says, no, I won't do it. And then finally, you know, Pitt forces him to do it. Well, that's clearly something illegitimate. Every soldier knows that. You don't kill a prisoner. Or there's another great movie called Casualties of War, which is based on a true story, where Sean Penn's character goes out and kidnaps a Vietnamese girl in the Vietnam War, and then they start raping her, and one of the guys says, I'm not going to participate, and Penn gets all upset, and then Penn's character goes and kills this girl. Well, everybody understands that, you know, Penn's character in real life, along with the other people that were raping this girl, went to the penitentiary, that you're not supposed to follow illegal orders. And that's all we're saying about Iraq. You had no congressional declaration of war. We know that. But two, here was the government, the country, attacking a country that had never attacked the United States. That is illegitimate. I mean, that's why the soldiers should have said to President Bush, no, I'm not going to obey your order, just like he would say no if he was ordered to rape somebody or ordered to murder a prisoner. What do you think?
Well, I'm not sure how much schooling they get and what counts as an immoral order or an unlawful order. I haven't been through the military, so I don't know what they're taught. Are they getting courses in the Constitution? To them, defending the Constitution means obeying the orders of the top constitutional officer in the country, which is the President of the United States. So I guess they feel if they got an order from the President that's passed down through the chain of command and given to them, that means it's constitutional and lawful, and they go ahead and do it. Because I don't know how many people lectured me on Twitter and an email that Kyle and the others were only following orders. And this was supposed to be a defense. Like I said last week, they say this without any irony, as if we've never heard that excuse before. They act like this, you know, how did I overlook such an obvious thing? They were following orders. So, you know, I don't know what they're taught, whether they're taught to scrutinize an order. Are they allowed to go ask someone, before I follow an order, I have to go consult our designated person here, our ombudsman, who tells me whether it's a lawful order? I don't think those mechanisms exist in the military. I have a feeling when you get an order, you're expected to just, you know, when you're told to jump, you say, how high? I mean, you have more contact with the military than I do. Is that wrong?
No, you're absolutely right, that the average soldier thinks in his mind that when he obeys the orders of the president, he is supporting and defending the Constitution. And if an enlisted man went over to his sergeant and said, Sergeant, I've looked at the Constitution and I don't see a declaration of war here. I don't think I can do this. The sergeant's going to upbraid him and say, Bud, you just do what you're told. Don't you bother that pretty little head of yours. The president has ordered you to do this and you're going to go and do it. So as a practical matter, that's why I've often argued this is one of the big problems of a standing army, is that they do whatever the president wants. I mean, he is their figurehead to whom they're really swearing allegiance. The Constitution is just a sham. But in terms of what they should do, I mean, and clearly, like in the movie Casualties of War, when Michael J. Fox's character started to report these rapists and kidnappers, man, he caught all kinds of flack. The commanding officers of his unit just said, "Shut up, keep it quiet." And he went one step further, and they told him the same thing. And I think it was only because it got out in the press that the military finally came under this pressure. I mean, but look at Lieutenant Calley. I mean, Calley's another example of where, they prosecuted the guy, but you kind of get the sense that it was a reluctant prosecution because people had found out about it. So yeah, I agree. I'm giving you what the soldier should do, but I totally agree with you. As a practical matter, the soldier's going to do whatever he's told to do. And so that's the Army mindset, left face and right face. It's all developed to follow orders. But that's, to me, the public school, too, that you need the citizenry to unconditionally support the troops so that whatever the troops are doing, the citizenry are there supporting them. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your service, regardless of what they're doing. I mean, I often wonder what would happen if the president, sent some military units to China to help them with their population control program. And what would happen with respect to, Catholics who support the troops if these troops were over there committing abortions in China. I mean, I think it would be an interesting experiment to see how Catholics would handle this, Catholic status, because one can imagine that they might say, we oppose the president's policy, but we support the troops. And as the troops are coming back at the airports, thank you for your service. Thank you for your service. But we really oppose what the president has ordered you to do. I mean, that to me is just nonsense. I mean, when people are engaged in wrongdoing, it's incumbent on the citizen not to thank the person who's doing it, obeying these orders, but to say, you need to stop what you're doing. Let me bring up another point, though, on the reality of this. There's also in this sense that whatever the government says is reality. That's another thing that I think is a big problem here, like this ISIS thing, where the government says ISIS is a threat to national security, and everybody adopts that. They don't even stop to question this is nonsense. ISIS is a threat to national security, and you see a glimpse of this with this Brian Williams thing, where Williams goes and just creates his own reality. And the television newscaster who said that he got shot at in a helicopter. My hunch, Sheldon, is after a while it really does become his reality. That he convinces himself that this is what he did, and then it's finally when he's faced with indisputable evidence that he didn't do it, then all of a sudden he says, oh, okay, now the new reality, the real reality. I think that's exactly what happens with people with respect to these malleable mindsets. Whatever the government says, whoever the new official enemy is, yes, that's America's new enemy, Saddam, bin Laden, ISIS, communism, terrorism, Muslims. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. That's a distinction with libertarians, that we don't automatically conform our minds to whatever they say reality is.
Well, and this is where, so much of the media is just shameless in their, just simply being a spokesman for the Defense Department, the State Department, the White House. They might as well just be state media. It couldn't more faithfully, trot out their line and feed it to the American people. They couldn't do that more faithfully if they were formally state media. I mean, it's as good at dishing out the government's line on basically everything as the Soviet media ever was, or the Cuban media, or any totalitarian or authoritarian state. They might as well just drop the facade and go on the government's payroll and become official news agencies of the regime, because that's all they do for the most part. I mean, luckily because of the internet, you can learn other things. But remember the days when there were 3 networks, and for the most part, there's some honorable exceptions, like when Walter Cronkite came back from an extended visit to Vietnam and said, within certain narrow confines, he said the government is basically giving us a lie. This is an unwinnable war. He didn't say it was a moral war, it was genocidal. He didn't say all that stuff. But he did break with the Johnson administration, by saying this is unwinnable. And it was, since it was so unusual for that to happen, for a major media person to say something like that, it was like a huge scandal almost. And so you have, Williams. I have a less charitable interpretation of Williams because his contemporaneous report in 2003 said nothing about his being on a helicopter that took fire. It was another helicopter that was well ahead of theirs and the group that he was in. It was only somewhat later that he begins to embellish and puts himself on the helicopter that was hit. All he needed to do was look at his original report. He would have seen he didn't say that at the time. Why wouldn't he have said it at the time if he'd been on a helicopter that took fire and had to crash land? So, I just think it was shabby self-promotion over the years. But, there's worse stuff than that. I mean, this very morning, we're speaking here on Monday, Joe Scarborough on his program on MSNBC said, without offering a scintilla of evidence, that, in defending the Netanyahu upcoming speech before Congress, which is totally designed to just sabotage negotiations with Iran, Scarborough says Iran, and this is a quote, has promised to build a nuclear weapon and has promised to use the nuclear weapon to annihilate Israel. There is zero truth value in that statement whatsoever. He could not come up with a single piece of evidence. No one asked him, of course, because everybody there just nodded their heads. But there is zero evidence for that. Gareth Porter's book, Manufactured Crisis, shows that Iran has never even attempted to build a nuclear weapon or require what you'd need to build a nuclear weapon, even though it's had an opportunity to do so. And it has never threatened to annihilate Israel. And yet he says this as if it's fact, as if everybody knows it, and think how irresponsible that is. And compared to what Williams said, that's pretty harmless. We're not going to end up going to war over Williams' lie, but this is the sort of thing that gets people prepared for war with Iran. And this is total recklessness. Right? This is worse than drunk driving, in my view.
Yeah, it's hard to know whether these people that do these type of things in the mainstream press are really just lying. I mean, knowingly and deliberately lying, or whether they just convince themselves of these kind of things because they know it pleases the government and they're currying favor, and then that becomes their reality. I mean, in the Vietnam War, I still get emails from people as part of this controversy that the troops were defending our freedom, and it's so interesting. They're convinced it's true, and when you challenge them and you say, "Really, tell me exactly how you were doing that," they're befuddled because nobody ever challenges them. I mean, North Vietnam never attacked the United States. So how are these troops defending our freedom? The fact is, our freedom was never a threat. And but boy, this is their reality. And so you look at guys like Scarborough and you wonder, what is going through his mind? Is he just making this up on purpose, or does he really just believe this because he wants to please the government? And anyway, that's the show. I think whatever we can do to raise awareness of the dangers of nationalism and this whole national security state apparatus, Cold War era apparatus that was grafted onto our governmental system, the government system of public schooling. More and more people have become aware of this and look at libertarians and say, hey, wow, you guys really are different. You engage in critical thinking, independent thinking. You don't automatically adopt whatever the authorities say. Who knows? More and more people might say, I kind of like that. And it's the type of thing I used to do from 0 to 6, birth to 6, when they were bedeviling their parents. Why? And that maybe with more people asking why, we get this nation back on the right track, which was really the goal, the track toward freedom, prosperity, peace, and harmony among people of the world. That's the show. Thank you very much for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.